June 22nd, 1941. The pre-dawn darkness along the Soviet-German border held its breath. In hidden positions among the forests and fields of western Russia, crews of T-26 light tanks waited in silence, their engines cold, their hatches closed against the morning chill. These men had no idea they were about to face the largest invasion force in human history. Within hours, over 3.5 million German and Axis troops would pour across the frontier in Operation Barbarossa, supported by 3,600 tanks and 2,700 aircraft. The German High Command expected total victory within 8 weeks. They had calculated for every contingency except one: the sheer determination of Soviet tank crews who refused to die quietly. The T-26 light tank was never meant to save the Soviet Union. By 1941, it was a 10-year-old design based on an even older British blueprint, the Vickers Mark E 6-ton tank. When Soviet buying committees visited England in 1930, they were searching for modern armoured vehicles to replace the antiquated T-18, itself a copy of the French Renault FT from the First World War. The Vickers design caught their attention immediately. Compact, reliable, and crucially simple enough for Soviet industry to mass produce, the tank embodied everything the Red Army needed as it modernized. 15 examples were purchased and shipped to the Soviet Union. By February 1931, Soviet engineers had adapted the design, and the first domestically produced T-26 rolled off the assembly line at the Bolshevik factory in Leningrad. Production would continue for the next decade, ultimately delivering over 11,000 tanks to the Red Army. It was the most produced tank in the world during the interwar period, making the Soviet Union the possessor of the largest armoured force ever assembled. The early T-26 model 1931 featured twin turrets mounted side by side, each armed with a single 7.62mm machine gun. It was an awkward configuration that severely limited the tank's firepower and tactical flexibility. By 1933, Soviet designers had corrected this flaw with the model 1933, which mounted a single larger turret armed with a 45mm 20K tank gun and a coaxial machine gun. This configuration would define the T-26 for the rest of its service life. The 45mm gun, though modest by later standards, was a potent weapon in the 1930s. It could penetrate the armour of any German tank at combat ranges and packed enough high explosive power to devastate infantry positions and light fortifications. The tank's armour, however, was its Achilles heel. The thickest sections measured just 15mm, later increased to 25mm on upgraded models. This was adequate protection against rifle-caliber machine guns and shell fragments, but practically useless against dedicated anti-tank weapons. Even the German 37mm PaK-36 anti-tank gun, which German soldiers would soon mockingly call the door knocker for its inability to penetrate heavier Soviet tanks, could punch through T-26 armour with ease. The T-26 weighed approximately 9.6 tons in combat configuration and was powered by a Gaz T-26 8-cylinder gasoline engine producing 91 horsepower. This gave it a maximum road speed of about 17 miles per hour, painfully slow compared to the 24 to 25 miles per hour achieved by contemporary German tanks. Cross-country performance was similarly unimpressive. The tank's narrow tracks and relatively high ground pressure meant it struggled in mud, snow and soft terrain. Reliability was mixed. In ideal conditions with proper maintenance, the T-26 was reasonably dependable. But by mid-1941, most T-26 in Red Army service had been driven hard through multiple campaigns with inadequate maintenance. Spare parts were chronically short. In some frontline armoured units, up to half the T-26 had major mechanical failures in engines, transmissions or suspension systems. These disabled tanks were cannibalised for parts to keep the remaining vehicles running. The T-26 first proved its worth in the Spanish Civil War. Starting in October 1936, the Soviet Union supplied approximately 281 T-26 tanks to the Republican forces fighting against Franco's nationalists. The Spanish Republicans were desperate for modern equipment, and the T-26 arrived at exactly the right moment. Spanish tank crews trained hastily at improvised schools found the T-26 easy to operate and maintain. More importantly, they discovered it was vastly superior to anything the nationalists could field. The German Panzer-Support light tanks, armed only with 2 machine guns, were helpless against the T-26's 45mm gun. Italian CV-33 and CV-35 tankettes were equally outmatched. In engagement after engagement, Republican T-26 demolished nationalist armour with impunity. The Battle of Guadalajara in March 1937 saw Republican T-26 completely annihilate Italian tankette formations, inflicting such casualties that Italian commanders refused to commit armour without overwhelming infantry support. German tank specialists observing the conflict were disturbed by what they witnessed. The T-26 demonstrated that light tanks with adequate guns could dominate a battlefield if properly employed. However, Spanish Republican commanders gradually squandered their advantage through poor tactics and dispersing their armour instead of concentrating it for decisive blows. By 1939, when Franco's forces finally triumphed, approximately 40% of the Republican T-26 had been captured and pressed into nationalist service. The irony was not lost on anyone. Tanks supplied by the Soviet Union to fight fascism were now serving fascist Spain. The Winter War against Finland from November 1939 to March 1940 revealed the T-26's fatal vulnerabilities. Finnish defenders, outnumbered and outgunned, developed devastatingly effective anti-tank tactics. Finnish soldiers armed with 37mm Bofors anti-tank guns found they could penetrate T-26 armour at virtually any range. Even Finnish 20mm anti-tank rifles could punch through the thin steel if the angle was favourable. Molotov cocktails, improvised gasoline bombs, became the terror of Soviet tank crews. Small teams of Finnish infantry would wait in ambush, often in deep snow or dense forest, letting T-26 advance into killing zones before attacking from multiple directions. The psychological effect was devastating. Soviet tankers learned to fear every snowbank, every tree line, every silent stretch of Finnish forest. The T-26's poor cross-country mobility in snow was an additional handicap. Tanks that should have been supporting infantry advances instead bogged down, became separated from their supporting units, and were picked off individually. Of the thousands of T-26s committed to the Winter War, the Soviets lost approximately 9 or 30, with nearly half damaged beyond repair or captured. Finland pressed many of these captured tanks into service with their own forces, creating the bizarre situation of T-26 fighting against T-26. The Finns would continue using captured T-26 well into the 1940s, with some remaining in Finnish service for non-combat purposes until 1961. On June 1, 1941, the Red Army possessed 10,268 T-26 light tanks of all models. They comprised approximately 41% of Soviet tank strength by number, making them by far the most numerous tank in Soviet service. T-26s equipped the majority of mechanized corps in the border military districts that would face the German invasion. The Western Special Military District alone fielded 1,336 T-26s, representing 52% of all tanks in the district. The Southwestern Front had 316 T-26, making up 35% of tank strength there. These numbers seemed impressive on paper. The reality was far grimmer. Approximately 30% of available T-26 were not operationally ready due to missing parts, batteries, tracks, or road wheels. Another 30% consisted of older models produced between 1931 and 1934, with severely limited remaining service life. When Soviet logistics officers conducted honest assessments, they estimated only about 3,100 to 3,200 T-26 were actually combat-ready, a figure only slightly less than the total number of German tanks earmarked for the invasion. But numbers told only part of the story. The German panzers were newer, faster, better armoured, and most critically crewed by soldiers with extensive training and combat experience. German tank doctrine emphasised combined arms operations, close coordination between tanks, infantry, artillery and air support. German tankers communicated via radio, allowing rapid tactical adjustments. Soviet tank units, by contrast, often lacked radios entirely or had them only in company commander vehicles. Tactical coordination was primitive. Orders were transmitted by flag signals or runners. The devastating purges of the late 1930s had decimated the Soviet officer corps, killing or imprisoning thousands of experienced commanders, including virtually all the Red Army's innovative armour theorists. The men leading Soviet tank units in June 1941 were often poorly trained political appointees, terrified of making decisions that might be interpreted as defeatist or counter-revolutionary. At 3:15 hours on June 22, 1941, German artillery opened fire all along the Soviet frontier. The shells fell like a steel rainstorm, targeting Soviet command posts, communication centres, supply dumps, and troop concentrations. 30 minutes later, German ground forces crossed the border in 3 massive army groups. Army Group North drove toward Leningrad, Army Group Center aimed for Moscow, and Army Group South pushed toward Kiev. The Luftwaffe struck simultaneously, catching Soviet aircraft on the ground in meticulously planned raids that destroyed over 1,000 planes in the first hours of combat. The Soviet border guards fought desperately, but they were hopelessly outnumbered and overwhelmed. Within hours, German spearheads had penetrated miles into Soviet territory. The nightmare had begun. Soviet mechanized corps were ordered to counterattack immediately. These orders were often delivered hours late, after German panzer divisions had already bypassed the positions the Soviet tanks were supposed to defend. Commanders who had never led units larger than a platoon suddenly found themselves trying to coordinate hundreds of tanks across vast distances without functioning communications. The results were catastrophic. Tank units advanced piecemeal, without infantry or artillery support, straight into German defensive positions bristling with anti-tank guns. Many T-26 never even reached the enemy. They broke down on the road, ran out of fuel because supply trucks couldn't find them, or were destroyed by German aircraft while moving in long unprotected columns. Yet amid the chaos and disaster, there were moments when the T-26 proved it was not entirely obsolete. When Soviet tank crews managed to achieve tactical surprise, when they caught German units in vulnerable positions, the 45mm gun showed it could still kill. The German tanks invading the Soviet Union were not the unstoppable juggernauts of popular imagination. Approximately 50% of German armour consisted of Panzer Thorn and Panzer II light tanks and Czech-built Panzer 35T and 38T models. These tanks were no better armoured than the T-26 and were often more lightly armed. The Panzer Thorn carried only machine guns. The Panzer II mounted a 20mm cannon. The Czech designs had 37mm guns. All of these vehicles were vulnerable to T-26 fire at combat ranges. Even the more formidable Panzer III and Panzer IV medium tanks, which formed the core of German panzer divisions, could be penetrated by T-26 guns if Soviet gunners hit the right spots at the right ranges. Near Zlobin in late June, a composite battalion of the 55th Tank Division demonstrated what T-26s could accomplish when, properly handled. The battalion consisted of 18 single-turret T-26 and 18 of the older twin-turret models, an odd mix that reflected the desperate state of Soviet logistics. These tanks were assigned to support the retreating 117th Infantry Division, providing a mobile rearguard to slow the German pursuit. The battalion commander, whose name has been lost to history, established a defensive position using the terrain intelligently. He positioned his tanks in ambush spots along the likely German approach routes, camouflaged them as best he could, and ordered his crews to hold fire until German armour was within 400 metres. When the Germans advanced, confident after days of almost uninterrupted victory, the T-26s opened fire simultaneously. At close range, the 45mm guns were devastatingly effective. The single-turret T-26 alone destroyed 17 German tanks in the engagement. The twin-turret models, armed only with machine guns, provided suppressive fire against German infantry. The German column recoiled, surprised by the sudden resistance. For a few precious hours, the German advance stalled while they brought up artillery and air support to suppress the Soviet position. By then, the 117th Infantry Division had gained the time it needed to establish new defensive lines. 9 T-26s from the battalion managed to cross the Dnieper River before the bridges were destroyed. 11 remained on the wrong side and were lost when German forces surrounded them. The rest had been knocked out during the fight, but the mission was accomplished. Against a vastly superior enemy, in a losing campaign, the T-26 crews had done their job. They had killed the enemy and bought time with their lives. On the Leningrad front, 3rd Lieutenant M.I. Yakovlev became one of the war's early heroes driving a T-26. Between December 20th and 26th, 1941, Yakovlev's tank supported Soviet infantry attacks from Kolpino toward Krasny Bor and Tosno. For 6 consecutive days of continuous combat, Yakovlev maneuvered his T-26 through intense German fire, attacking enemy positions with both his main gun and machine gun. His tank destroyed 2 concrete pillboxes, 3 anti-tank guns, 4 machine gun nests, and 3 mortar positions. He also knocked out a German ammunition depot, triggering a massive explosion that disrupted enemy operations in the sector. Yakovlev's crew killed approximately 200 German soldiers during those 6 days. The remarkable aspect of this achievement was not just the destruction inflicted, but the punishment Yakovlev's T-26 absorbed. German gunners hit his tank with 9 armor-piercing shells. 9 times the thin armor was penetrated. 9 times Yakovlev's crew somehow survived. Shell fragments wounded crew members, equipment was smashed. But the engine kept running, the gun kept firing, and the tank never stopped fighting. On the 7th day, with his tank barely holding together, Yakovlev finally withdrew to refit. For his extraordinary courage and skill, he was awarded Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest military decoration in the Soviet armed forces. His achievement demonstrated that even obsolete equipment could be effective in the hands of a skilled, determined crew. The mathematics of attrition favoured the Germans overwhelmingly. For every German tank the Soviets destroyed, they lost 6 or more of their own. Superior German tactics, training and coordination multiplied their effectiveness far beyond their numerical strength. The Luftwaffe's air superiority was particularly devastating. German Stuka dive bombers hunted Soviet tank columns mercilessly, destroying vehicles that had survived ground combat but were helpless against aerial attack. Soviet tankers learned to dread the distinctive scream of diving Stukas, a sound that meant death was incoming and there was nothing they could do to stop it. German anti-tank guns were equally lethal. The 37mm Pak-36, despite its later reputation for ineffectiveness, could destroy T-26 with ease. Heavier guns like the 50mm Pak-38 and the legendary 88mm flak gun used in the anti-tank role could annihilate T-26 at ranges where the Soviet tanks couldn't even fight back. By the end of 1941, the vast majority of the Red Army's T-26 were gone. Of the more than 10,000 in service when the war began, perhaps fewer than 500 remained operational by New Year's Day 1942. Most were destroyed in combat. Many more were abandoned due to mechanical failure, lack of fuel, or lack of ammunition. Soviet doctrine at the time ordered crews to destroy any tank that couldn't be recovered to prevent it from falling into German hands. Thousands of T-26 were blown up or burned by their own crews as the Red Army retreated eastward. The Germans captured substantial numbers anyway. Several hundred T-26 ended up serving in German, Romanian and Hungarian units, though they were rarely used as frontline combat vehicles. The Germans preferred to employ captured T-26 as artillery tractors, self-propelled anti-tank gun platforms, or for rear area security duties. The thin armour that made them vulnerable in combat made them perfectly adequate for roles that didn't involve direct combat with enemy armour. Despite catastrophic losses, the T-26 continued fighting throughout 1942 and into 1943. Tanks transferred from reserve units in Central Asia, the Urals, Siberia and the Far East replaced some of the losses. By October 1941, the Western Front still fielded 298 T-26, representing 62% of its total tank strength. These tanks participated in the desperate defensive battles around Moscow that winter, helping to stop the German advance just short of the capital. T-26 fought at Stalingrad, in the Caucasus, and on every sector of the vast Eastern Front. Some tank units of the Leningrad Front continued operating T-26 until 1944, primarily because the siege prevented new equipment from reaching the city. These tanks were often heavily modified, with additional armour plates bolted onto the hull and turret, increasing protection but overloading the already strained chassis and engine. Crews were advised to use low gears only, as the extra weight put tremendous stress on the transmission. The T-26's last major combat role came in August 1945 in an entirely different theatre, when the Soviet Union finally declared war on Japan and launched Operation August Storm, the invasion of Manchuria. 1,672 T-26 light tanks participated. By this point, the T-26 was spectacularly obsolete, utterly outclassed by every modern tank design in the world. But Japanese forces in Manchuria were not equipped with modern armour. The Kwantung Army had been stripped of its best units, equipment, and personnel for the war in the Pacific. What remained were second-rate divisions with limited armor support. Against these forces, the T-26 was adequate. Soviet mechanized units, spearheaded by the far superior T-34s but supported by hundreds of aging T-26, sliced through Japanese defenses with shocking speed. The campaign lasted only a few weeks, ending with the complete destruction of the Kwantung Army. It was the T-26's final bow, a last hurrah for a design that had served for 14 years. The legacy of the T-26 is complex and often misunderstood. Western historians frequently dismiss it as obsolete junk that was easily swept aside by superior German armour in 1941. This interpretation is both correct and misleading. Yes, the T-26 was obsolete by 1941 standards. Yes, it suffered catastrophic losses in the early months of Barbarossa. But the simple fact of the T-26's existence in such enormous numbers forced the Germans to fight a different kind of campaign than they had planned. German intelligence before the invasion estimated Soviet tank strength at perhaps 10,000 vehicles total. They were not far off numerically, but they failed to grasp the implications. Even obsolete tanks require anti-tank guns to destroy. They tie up infantry. They force the enemy to pause, deploy, coordinate combined arms responses. Every hour the Germans spent destroying T-26s was an hour they weren't advancing toward Moscow. Every German anti-tank gun assigned to deal with T-26s was a gun that couldn't be used elsewhere. Every artillery shell and aircraft bomb expended on destroying T-26 was ammunition that couldn't target Soviet infantry, artillery or supply lines. The Soviet Union's decision to mass-produce the T-26 in the 1930s has been criticized as short-sighted. By 1941, it was clear the design was inadequate for modern warfare. Soviet designers knew this and had developed the T-34 medium tank as a replacement, a vastly superior vehicle that would become one of the war's best tanks. But T-34 production only began in earnest in 1940, and by June 1941 only about 1,000 were in service, scattered across various units. The Red Army needed tanks immediately, in huge numbers. The T-26 provided those numbers. Soviet industry could build T-26s quickly and cheaply. Crews could be trained on them rapidly. Maintenance requirements were modest. When the invasion came, the Soviet Union had over 20,000 tanks total, though most were T-26 and BT light tanks rather than modern designs. This massive numerical advantage, even with obsolete equipment, proved crucial. It gave the Red Army time to mobilize its vast reserves, evacuate its industry eastward beyond German reach, and begin producing the T-34s and other modern weapons that would eventually turn the tide. There's a human dimension to the T-26's story that often gets lost in discussions of technical specifications and kill ratios. Each of those 10,000 plus T-26 that existed in June 1941 was crewed by 3 men: a commander, a gunner, and a driver. These were mostly young men, barely out of their teens in many cases, conscripts who had received perhaps a few weeks of training before being assigned to tank units. They knew their equipment was inferior. They could see that German tanks were faster, better armoured, better armed. They understood that their survival chances were minimal. Many of them died in the first days of the war, their tanks exploding after a single hit from a German gun, burned alive in vehicles that became crematoriums. Others lasted longer, gradually learning the brutal lessons of armoured combat, discovering the narrow margins between life and death in a machine that offered almost no protection. The crews who survived the early disasters became veterans, skilled tankers who knew how to use terrain, how to pick ambush positions, when to shoot and when to run. These men taught the next generation of Soviet tankers, passing along the hard-won knowledge that would eventually help the Red Army defeat the Wehrmacht. Consider what it must have been like to crew a T-26 in combat. The interior was cramped, hot, and incredibly loud when the engine was running and the gun firing. Visibility was poor even with all hatches open. In combat, buttoned up with hatches closed, the commander's view of the outside world was limited to narrow vision slits and periscopes that gave only fragmented glimpses of the battlefield. Communication between crew members was difficult over the engine noise. Radios, when they existed at all, were unreliable. The smell inside the tank was a mixture of gasoline, oil, gunpowder, and human sweat. The thin armour transmitted heat brutally in summer and cold in winter. Every impact against the armour, even machine gun bullets that didn't penetrate, created a deafening clang and shower of sparks from the interior surface. Armor-piercing hits that penetrated sent molten metal fragments ricocheting around the crew compartment, shredding human flesh. Fire was the constant terror. Gasoline engines meant the T-26 was far more prone to catastrophic fires than diesel-powered tanks. A penetrating hit near the fuel tanks could transform the vehicle into an inferno in seconds. Crews who survived such hits often bore horrific burn scars for the rest of their lives. The tactical limitations of the T-26 forced Soviet commanders to develop innovative solutions. Since the tank was too slow to conduct mobile operations against German armour, it was increasingly used in static defensive roles or for infantry support in deliberate attacks. T-26 would be dug into prepared positions, sometimes with only the turret exposed, functioning essentially as mobile pillboxes. This maximised their defensive value while minimising their vulnerability to enemy fire. In offensive operations, T-26s worked closely with infantry, moving forward in short bounds from one covered position to the next, using their guns to suppress enemy strongpoints and enable the infantry to advance. This was grinding, attritional warfare, completely different from the sweeping armoured manoeuvres the Germans executed so brilliantly. But it was warfare the Red Army could sustain. The Soviet Union had seemingly endless reserves of men and a rapidly growing industrial base that, despite horrific losses in the war's first months, was beginning to outproduce Germany. Some T-26s received significant modifications that extended their combat viability. The most common upgrade was applique armour, additional steel plates bolted onto the hull and turret. During the Winter War, approximately 69 T-26s were up-armoured this way, with plates 15 to 40 mm thick added to the frontal areas. This brought the weight up to about 12 tons, creating serious mechanical strain, but made the tank significantly more resistant to Finnish anti-tank guns. Similar modifications were performed on roughly 100 T-26 during the Siege of Leningrad, the Siege of Odessa, and the Battle of Moscow, using whatever steel plate could be scavenged from local factories. The results were mixed. The additional armour did improve protection against lighter German anti-tank weapons, but the mechanical reliability suffered terribly. Engines designed for a 9.6-ton vehicle struggled to move 12 tons. Transmissions and suspensions failed at accelerated rates. Still, for desperate situations the trade-off was worth it. A tank that broke down after killing one or two German vehicles was better than a tank that was knocked out without firing a shot. The flamethrower variants of the T-26 deserve special mention. The Soviets produced approximately 300 flamethrowing tanks based on the T-26 chassis, designated KHT-26, KHT-130 and KHT-133, though they were officially called BKCM-3 for Fighting Chemical Vehicle. These tanks replaced the main gun, or one of the machine guns, with a flame projector capable of shooting burning liquid out to about 60 meters. The psychological effect of flame weapons was enormous. German soldiers who faced flamethrower tanks reported being terrified even when the flames didn't actually reach them. The sight of fire being projected at high velocity, the distinctive roar and black smoke triggered primal fears. Flamethrowing T-26s were used extensively during the breakthrough of the Mannerheim Line in the Winter War, and again during the early months of Barbarossa. However, they had severe tactical limitations. The flame projector had very short range compared to the 45mm gun, meaning flamethrower tanks had to get suicidally close to their targets. German soldiers quickly learned that these tanks were priority targets to be destroyed before they could approach close enough to use their weapons. Additionally, many flamethrower tanks were later converted back to gun-armed configuration by replacing the flame equipment with standard 45mm guns, reflecting the greater utility of a proper anti-tank weapon. Production of the T-26 officially ended in February 1941, when Factory No. 174 in Leningrad completed its last tanks and began retooling to produce the T-50 light tank, a far more capable design intended as the T-26's replacement. However, the German invasion disrupted these plans catastrophically. The T-50 proved too complex for wartime mass production and never entered large-scale service. Ironically, Factory No. 174 ended up assembling about 47 more T-26 in July and August 1941, using hulls, turrets and parts already in stock before the factory was evacuated from besieged Leningrad. This made the T-26 one of the few weapon systems where production actually resumed after being officially terminated, a testament to both Soviet desperation and the design's relative simplicity. Even after production ceased, repair and maintenance of T-26s continued throughout the war. Factory number 174 repaired 846 T-26 during 1941 before evacuation. Other facilities performed similar work. Approximately 75 turrets from scrapped T-26 and the unsuccessful T-50 were mounted as fixed bunkers in the defensive lines around Leningrad, providing fortified gun positions that contributed to the city's defense during the 900-day siege. The story of the T-26 intersects with one of the war's great what-ifs. Soviet tank designers in the late 1930s understood clearly that the T-26 was approaching obsolescence. They developed the T-50 as its replacement, incorporating lessons from the Winter War and from examining captured German Panzer IIIs. The T-50 was genuinely impressive for a light tank. It had 37mm of well-sloped frontal armour, a 45mm gun with improved ammunition, a diesel engine for better fuel efficiency and reduced fire risk, and a top speed of about 40 miles per hour. It was heavier than the T-26 at about 14 tons, but far more capable in every respect. If the T-50 had entered mass production in 1940 as planned, the Red Army in June 1941 would have fielded thousands of modern light tanks instead of obsolete T-26. The course of the opening battles might have been significantly different, but the T-50 encountered production difficulties. Its diesel engine was temperamental. The tank required more sophisticated manufacturing techniques than Soviet factories were prepared for. By June 1941, almost no T-50s had been delivered to field units. After the invasion, Soviet industry prioritized T-34 and KV production over the T-50, reasoning correctly that medium and heavy tanks offered better return on investment. The T-50 program was eventually cancelled after fewer than 100 examples were built, so the T-26 fought on by default, not because it was adequate, but because nothing better was available in sufficient numbers. The captured T-26s that ended up serving Axis forces provide an interesting footnote. The Germans designated captured T-26s as Panzerkampfwagen T-26R, with the R denoting Russian origin. Most saw limited combat use. The thin armour made them death traps when facing any significant anti-tank weapons. Instead, the Germans used them for training, for rear area security patrols hunting partisans, and as the basis for improvised self-propelled guns. Some captured T-26 had their turrets removed and were fitted with German 75mm PaK 97-38 anti-tank guns, creating makeshift tank destroyers. The Romanians and Hungarians similarly pressed captured T-26 into service, usually for second-line duties. The Finns, who captured hundreds during the Winter War, and additional examples during the continuation war against the Soviet Union from 1941 to 1944. Made more extensive use of their T-26. Finnish tankers painted them in distinctive three-colour camouflage and often modified them with improved radios, better sights, and occasionally upgunning them with captured Soviet 76mm guns. Finnish T-26 fought against their former owners with reasonable effectiveness, particularly when used defensively in the heavily forested Finnish terrain that negated German advantages in mobility and long-range gunnery. When historians assess the T-26's combat record, the statistics appear damning. Thousands were destroyed in just the first few weeks of Barbarossa. Soviet mechanized corps that fielded hundreds of T-26 in June were reduced to handfuls by July. The kill-to-loss ratio was abysmal, with estimates suggesting Soviet tanks, including T-26, were destroyed at rates of 6-1 or worse compared to German tanks. These numbers seem to confirm that the T-26 was obsolete, inadequate, a wasted investment that contributed little to Soviet survival. This interpretation is incomplete. Every T-26 that fought, however briefly, consumed German resources. Every German soldier who died to T-26 fire was one fewer soldier pushing toward Moscow. Every German tank destroyed by a T-26 was one fewer tank threatening Soviet positions. Every day the Germans spent destroying T-26 was one more day the Soviet Union had to mobilize its reserves and evacuate its industry. In the terrible arithmetic of total war, even obsolete tanks had value. They bought time, the one thing the Soviet Union desperately needed in 1941. Time to move factories beyond the Urals, time to train new armies, time to bring the T-34 and KV-1 into mass production, time for General Winter to arrive and slow the German advance. In this context, the T-26's catastrophic losses were not meaningless waste, but rather a form of strategic sacrifice, blood and steel offered up to purchase survival. The psychological impact of the T-26 on German soldiers is harder to quantify, but shouldn't be ignored. Yes, German panzer crews and anti-tank gunners quickly learned they could destroy T-26s with relative ease, but there were so many of them. German soldiers advancing into the Soviet Union reported being shocked by the sheer scale of Soviet material. Destroyed Soviet tanks littered every road and field. The Germans kept destroying them, and more kept appearing. This relentless pressure, the sense of fighting an enemy with apparently infinite resources, eroded German morale even as they achieved stunning tactical victories. The T-26 contributed to this psychological burden. It wasn't a fearsome weapon individually, but collectively, as part of the vast Soviet war machine, it represented a frightening reality. The Soviet Union could afford to lose thousands of tanks and keep fighting. Germany could not. The Wehrmacht's initial tank strength of about 3,400 vehicles for Barbarossa was spread across the entire Eastern Front. Losses were difficult to replace. Germany's tank production in 1941 was about 3,800 vehicles total for the entire year. The Soviet Union, despite losing thousands of tanks and much of its Western industrial capacity, still managed to produce approximately 6,500 tanks in 1941. This production disparity would widen dramatically as the war continued. By 1943, Soviet tank production exceeded 24,000 vehicles annually, while German production struggled to reach 10,000. The T-26, as the most numerous tank in Soviet pre-war production, established the industrial base and trained workforce that enabled this massive wartime expansion. Individual stories of T-26 crews are rare in the historical record. The chaos of the early war, the catastrophic Soviet casualties, and the Soviet system's tendency to suppress personal narratives in favour of collective heroism mean that most T-26 tankers died anonymously. We know 3rd Lieutenant Yakovlev earned Hero of the Soviet Union. We know about the composite battalion at Zlobin that destroyed 17 German tanks. But the names of the men who crewed those tanks, the specific battles they fought, the moments of terror and courage that defined their brief lives, these are mostly lost. We can imagine them, though. A 19-year-old driver from a Ukrainian collective farm, conscripted in 1940, given 3 weeks of training on the T-26's clutch and gearbox before being assigned to a tank company. A gunner from Moscow, a factory worker in civilian life, who learned to aim the 45mm gun by shooting at targets on a range, never imagining he'd be firing at German panzers within a year. A commander, maybe 23 years old, a loyal Communist Party member who volunteered for tank service, who finds himself suddenly responsible for 3 lives including his own, making desperate decisions with incomplete information while German shells bracket his position. These men fought knowing they would probably die. Some died without ever seeing the enemy, killed by artillery or air attack while moving to their positions. Others got into their combat, found themselves surprised when their guns actually worked and killed German vehicles, experienced a fierce joy before a 37mm armour-piercing round punched through their turret and ended everything. A few survived, learned, became skilled tankers, and eventually traded their worn-out T-26 for new T-34s or other modern tanks. These survivors formed the cadre of experience that rebuilt the Red Army's armoured forces. By 1943, the T-26 had largely vanished from frontline Soviet service in the West. The last significant numbers were withdrawn from combat units and relegated to training, with new tank crews learning basic skills on the obsolete T-26 before transitioning to modern combat vehicles. In the Far East, however, T-26 remained in service with units facing the Japanese Kwantung Army. Soviet commanders correctly assessed that Japanese anti-tank capabilities in Manchuria were limited and that T-26 would be adequate for the role. This proved correct in August 1945, when Soviet forces crushed Japanese resistance with relative ease. The last combat use of T-26 in Soviet service occurred during those operations. After Japan's surrender, T-26 were quickly phased out. Most were scrapped. A handful were preserved as monuments or for museum display. Today, perhaps a few dozen T-26s survive worldwide, most in museums or as static displays. Very few are maintained in running condition, The design itself influenced subsequent Soviet tank development more than is often recognized. The experience of mass-producing the T-26 taught Soviet industry invaluable lessons about tank manufacturing. The simple construction techniques, the use of riveted armour rather than more complex welding in early models, and the straightforward mechanical systems established manufacturing practices that scaled up for later designs. The 45mm gun developed for the T-26 continued in Soviet service throughout the war, arming various vehicles and serving as the basis for improved anti-tank guns. The tactical lessons learned painfully by T-26 crews in Spain, Finland, and the early months of Barbarossa directly informed Soviet armour doctrine. The recognition that light tanks needed better armour led to the development of successively heavier designs. The understanding that speed and mobility mattered as much as firepower influenced the T-34's design. The terrible casualties suffered when tanks operated without infantry support reinforced the importance of combined arms operations, a lesson the Red Army slowly internalized. We should acknowledge what the T-26 was not. It was not a war-winning weapon. It did not achieve decisive victories or change the course of major battles. Its technical characteristics were mediocre even when new and obsolete by 1941. German soldiers did not fear it the way they would come to fear T-34s. The T-26 will never be celebrated like the Sherman, the Panther, or other iconic tanks of World War II. But perhaps that's exactly why the T-26 deserves recognition. It was not heroic. It was simply there, in enormous numbers, crewed by ordinary men doing an impossible job with inadequate equipment. The T-26 represents the unglamorous reality of industrial warfare. Most combat is not about decisive breakthrough or brilliant tactical maneuvers. It's about attrition, about bleeding the enemy, about holding positions or buying time even when the outcome seems hopeless. The T-26 excelled at nothing except existing in vast numbers and forcing the enemy to expend resources destroying it. In the horrific calculus of the Eastern Front, this was enough. The T-26 didn't save the Soviet Union, but it bought time for the tanks that would. That's its legacy. Not glory, just grim necessity. Not triumph, just survival. For the men who crewed these obsolete machines into battle against impossible odds, that was more than enough. The German perspective on the T-26 evolved considerably as the war progressed. In the first days of Barbarossa, Wehrmacht after-action reports described Soviet armour with a mixture of contempt and surprise. The contempt came from how easily T-26 were destroyed. The surprise came from how many existed. German intelligence had badly underestimated Soviet tank numbers. Panzer commanders expected to face perhaps a few hundred tanks on each axis of advance. Instead, they encountered thousands. Lieutenant Hans von Luck, commanding a reconnaissance battalion in the 7th Panzer Division, wrote in his diary on June 24, 1941, describing an encounter near Minsk. "We destroyed 11 Soviet tanks today, all of the light type with the small turret and 45mm gun. They attacked without coordination, almost as if each tank commander was operating independently. Our Pair 36 guns knocked them out at ranges exceeding 500 meters. The crews fought bravely but stupidly, continuing to advance even as we destroyed them one by one. What troubles me is not their quality, but their quantity. We've destroyed perhaps 50 Soviet tanks in 3 days. How many more do they have?" The answer, which would become increasingly clear to German commanders over the coming weeks, was thousands more. And behind those thousands were the factories producing additional thousands. The Battle of Brody in late June 1941 illustrated both the T-26's limitations and its role in the larger Soviet defensive effort. This engagement, one of the largest tank battles in history at that point, involved Soviet mechanized corps attempting to cut off German spearheads driving toward Lvov. The Soviet 8th Mechanized Corps fielded approximately 100 T-26 among its roughly 800 tanks. These T-26 were assigned to support roles, protecting flanks and providing fire support, while the heavier KV-1s and T-34s attempted to smash through German positions. The battle was a catastrophe for the Soviets. Poor coordination, inadequate fuel supplies, constant German air attacks, and the superior tactical skills of German commanders resulted in the destruction of most Soviet armour. The 8th Mechanized Corps lost approximately 90% of its tanks within a week. But those T-26s that did engage German forces performed their basic function adequately. They killed German soldiers. They destroyed German vehicles. They forced German units to deploy and fight rather than simply advancing. A German combat engineer, Feldwebel Otto Carius, who would later become one of Germany's most successful tank aces, encountered T-26s during the Brody fighting. His memoir, written decades later, recalled the moment. "We were advancing in our half-tracks when someone screamed, 'Panzer Links!' to the left. I saw 3 Soviet tanks emerge from a tree line, perhaps 300 meters away. They were small, antiquated-looking things, but their guns were firing. One round hit the half-track ahead of ours, killing everyone inside instantly. We dismounted and scattered. Our park crew set up with admirable speed and engaged. 2 Soviet tanks were destroyed immediately. The third retreated back into the trees, trailing smoke. Later, examining the knocked-out tanks, I was struck by how primitive they seemed. Thin armour, cramped interiors, simple construction. But those guns worked, and the men inside them had fought. That's what mattered. The T-26's simplicity, often cited as a weakness, occasionally proved advantageous. Complex weapons systems require skilled maintenance, adequate spare parts, and time for repairs. In the chaos of 1941, Soviet tank units had none of these. Vehicles broke down constantly. Repair facilities were destroyed or captured. Spare parts were non-existent. Under these conditions, the T-26's mechanical simplicity meant it could be field repaired more easily than more sophisticated designs. A T-26 with a damaged track could be fixed by its crew in a few hours using basic tools. A T-34 with similar damage might require specialized equipment and trained mechanics. This mattered desperately in the grinding retreat of summer and fall 1941. Tank units needed to maintain mobility, to fall back ahead of German encirclements. Every tank that could be quickly repaired and kept running was one more tank that might survive to fight another day. Senior Lieutenant Vladimir Alexeyev, a maintenance officer with the 43rd Tank Division, described the desperate repair efforts in a post-war interview. "We worked miracles with nothing. A T-26 would come back with its engine dying, transmission grinding, tracks barely holding together. We'd cannibalize 2 broken tanks to make 1 working tank. We'd use wire, rope, even leather, belts to jury-rig repairs. The T-26 was forgiving that way. It didn't need precision parts or special tools. You could fix it with a hammer, a wrench, and determination. I kept tanks running that any manual said were beyond repair. Those tanks went back into action and some of them survived the war. That wouldn't have been possible with more complex vehicles." The urban warfare that characterized much of the Eastern Front played to certain T-26 strengths. In cities and towns, the long-range gunnery advantages of German tanks disappeared. Combat occurred at point-blank ranges where the T-26's 45mm gun was perfectly adequate. The tank's small size allowed it to maneuver through narrow streets and hide behind buildings. Its simplicity meant crews could operate it effectively even with limited training, crucial when units suffered catastrophic casualties and replacements arrived with minimal preparation. During the defense of Odessa from August to October 1941, T-26s formed a substantial portion of the defending armour. The city, besieged by Romanian forces with German support, held out for 73 days before evacuation. T-26 tanks operated in small groups, supporting infantry in street fighting, conducting localized counterattacks, and providing mobile fire support. The urban environment negated many German advantages. Romanian forces, less well-equipped than their German allies, found T-26s to be formidable opponents in close-quarters combat. Soviet tankers learned to use buildings for cover, to ambush enemy forces from side streets, to fire and displace before German artillery could target them. Lieutenant Dmitry Lavrinenko, who would become one of the Soviet Union's highest-scoring tank aces with 52 confirmed kills, began his career commanding a T-26 in street fighting around Kiev. His early experiences taught him the fundamentals of survival in armoured combat. Use terrain, always be moving, shoot first, know your escape routes. These lessons, learned in an obsolete tank against superior enemies, served him well when he later transitioned to T-34s. The winter of 1941 to 1942 brought conditions that affected all armoured vehicles, but hit the T-26 particularly hard. temperatures plummeted to -40 degrees Celsius in some areas. German tanks designed for European conditions suffered catastrophic mechanical failures. Engines wouldn't start. Transmissions froze solid. Gun recoil mechanisms seized. The German army was unprepared for winter warfare, lacking cold-weather lubricants, antifreeze and winterization equipment. Soviet tanks had similar problems, but Soviet crews had experience with extreme cold. They knew to light fires under engines to warm them before starting, to mix lower viscosity oils that flowed in freezing temperatures, to keep engines running constantly rather than shutting them down. The T-26's gasoline engine actually had advantages in extreme cold compared to diesel engines. Gasoline engines started more reliably in frigid conditions because gasoline's lower viscosity meant it atomized and ignited more easily than diesel fuel. Soviet tankers also employed crude but effective winterization techniques. They drained coolant every night and warmed it over fires before refilling engines in the morning. They wrapped engines in blankets and tarps. They stationed crew members to start engines periodically through the night to prevent them freezing. These measures worked better with the T-26's simple engine than with more complex power plants. Still, winter took a terrible toll. Tanks that survived German guns succumbed to mechanical failure in the cold. Frozen tracks shattered like glass when tanks attempted to move. Batteries died. Hydraulic systems failed. By January 1942, the number of operational T-26 in frontline service had dwindled to perhaps 300 or 400 tanks across the entire active front, down from thousands just 6 months earlier. The Moscow counter-offensive in December 1941 represented the Red Army's first successful major operation of the war. Soviet forces, reinforced by divisions from Siberia and the Far East, struck German units frozen in position around the capital. T-26s participated in this offensive, though in diminishing numbers. Their role was primarily infantry support, advancing with rifle units to suppress German strongpoints and provide covering fire. The deep snow limited mobility for all tanks, but the T-26's narrow tracks and high ground pressure made it particularly vulnerable to bogging down. Crews learned to follow roads whenever possible, even though roads were obvious targets for German anti-tank guns. Off-road movement in deep snow risked becoming helplessly stuck, transforming the tank into a stationary target. Senior Sergeant Ivan Liuty commanded a T-26 during the counter-offensive near Klin. His tank supported infantry assaults on German positions for 11 consecutive days in temperatures below -30 degrees. His crew kept the engine running day and night, taking turns sleeping in shifts while one man monitored the gauges. They fired their last ammunition on December 17th, destroying a German half-track and machine gun position. With no ammunition remaining and fuel nearly exhausted, Liuty requested permission to withdraw for resupply. Permission was denied. His orders were to maintain his position and use his tank's presence to support the infantry even without ammunition. For 3 more days, Liuty's T-26 manoeuvred around the battlefield, its very presence causing German forces to deploy and take defensive measures, though it couldn't fire a shot. On the 4th day, a German pack gun finally hit the tank, killing the driver and wounding Liuty. The crew abandoned the burning vehicle. Liuty survived and eventually commanded T-34s and later IS-2 heavy tanks. In interviews after the war, he spoke about his T-26 with affection. It was obsolete, underpowered, under-armoured, and uncomfortable. But it never quit on us. That engine ran, for 2 weeks straight in horrible cold. It brought us through when better tanks might have failed. You can't ask more than that. The siege of Leningrad created unique conditions where T-26s remained in service far longer than anywhere else on the Eastern Front. The city was cut off from September 1941 until January 1944, nearly 900 days of siege warfare. No new tanks could reach Leningrad except across the frozen Lake Ladoga during winter, a dangerous route under constant German artillery fire. The forces defending Leningrad had to make do with whatever equipment was trapped inside the pocket. This included approximately 300 T-26 tanks of various models. These tanks were maintained through heroic improvisation. The Kirov factory, despite being under constant German artillery bombardment, continued repairing damaged tanks throughout the siege. Workers, many of them women and teenagers, fabricated spare parts from whatever materials were available. When proper armor plate ran out, they used steel from dismantled buildings and ships. When standard ammunition was exhausted, They manufactured improvised shells using artillery projectiles modified to fit the 45mm guns. The T-26 defending Leningrad were increasingly modified with additional armour, turning them into slow, overweight, mechanically stressed vehicles that bore little resemblance to their original configuration. Some mounted additional turrets cannibalized from destroyed tanks. Others had flamethrowers installed. A few were converted into ammunition carriers or recovery vehicles, but they kept fighting. During the January 1943 offensive that finally broke the siege, creating a narrow land corridor into Leningrad, T-26 formed part of the armoured spearhead. These ancient tanks, many of them in service since the 1930s, still had teeth. They supported infantry in clearing German strongpoints, destroyed German bunkers with direct fire, and provided mobile fire support that enabled Soviet forces to link up with units advancing from outside the pocket. The partisan warfare behind German lines represented another role, where T-26 made contributions, though in unexpected ways. When Soviet forces retreated in 1941, some units were cut off behind advancing German spearheads. Rather than surrender, these units often took to the forests and swamps, forming partisan groups that harassed German supply lines. Some partisan formations included tanks that had been abandoned due to mechanical failure or fuel shortages but were later recovered and repaired. T-26s, with their simple construction and easy maintenance, were especially suitable for partisan use. Several documented cases exist of partisan units operating T-26 from forest bases, emerging to ambush German convoys before disappearing back into the wilderness. These operations were necessarily limited. Fuel and ammunition were nearly impossible to obtain. Mechanical parts required improvisation. But the psychological impact was significant. German rear area units, already nervous about partisan attacks, became even more cautious when reports circulated of Soviet tanks operating behind the lines. Convoys required heavier escorts. Garrison troops demanded reinforcement. The German rear area security burden increased, pulling troops and resources away from the front. One partisan commander, Pyotr Vershigora, described in his memoirs how his unit maintained 2 T-26s in operational condition through the winter of 1941 to 1942. The tanks had been abandoned by retreating Soviet forces near Bryansk. Vershigora's partisans repaired them, using parts from a third destroyed tank, fueled them with gasoline stolen from German supply dumps, and armoured them with ammunition captured in raids. In January 1942, these 2 T-26 led a partisan attack on a German supply convoy, destroying 8 trucks and killing approximately 40 German soldiers. The tanks then withdrew into the forest before German reinforcements arrived. This single action tied down an entire German security battalion for 3 weeks, as they searched for the partisan base, diverting forces that might otherwise have been sent to the front. By mid-1942, the T-26 had effectively disappeared from frontline Soviet armoured units in the West, replaced by T-34s, KV-1s, and American-supplied Lend-Lease tanks. The surviving T-26 were concentrated in training units, where they served to give new tankers basic skills before transitioning to combat vehicles. This role was important. Soviet tank losses in 1941 and 1942 were astronomical, requiring a constant flow of replacement crews. These men needed training, but using frontline combat tanks for training wasted resources and risked losing valuable equipment to accidents. T-26 were perfect for this role. They taught basic skills like driving, gunnery, and radio operation. Trainees learned on obsolete equipment that, if destroyed in training accidents, cost the Red Army little operational capability. Thousands of Soviet tankers received their initial training on T-26 before moving to modern tanks and heading to the front. This indirect contribution to Soviet victory was perhaps the T-26's most important role in the war's middle and late years. The trainers who taught on T-26s were often veterans who had survived the early disasters, men who had learned armoured warfare the hard way. They passed along lessons purchased with blood: how to read terrain and find good firing positions, when to shoot and when to relocate, how to coordinate with infantry and artillery, the fundamentals of survival in armoured combat. These lessons, taught on obsolete T-26 far from the front, saved lives when new crews reached combat units and faced German tanks for real. The Finnish Army's experience with captured T-26 provides an interesting counterpoint to Soviet experiences. Finland captured approximately 100 T-26s during the Winter War and another 50 or so during the Continuation War. Finnish tankers, operating these tanks against their original owners, achieved results that Soviet crews rarely matched. Several factors explain this disparity. Finnish crews received better training, operating in smaller units with better coordination. They used the T-26 in roles suited to its capabilities, defensive ambushes and infantry support, rather than forcing it into offensive operations where its weaknesses were exposed. Finnish maintenance was superior, with tanks receiving proper repairs and regular servicing. Most importantly, Finnish forces operated in terrain they knew intimately, using forests, lakes, and hills to negate Soviet advantages in numbers and firepower. The Finnish 4th Tank Battalion, equipped primarily with captured T-26s, fought throughout the Continuation War with creditable success. In June 1944, during the major Soviet offensive that pushed Finland toward armistice, Finnish T-26 fought desperate defensive actions against overwhelming Soviet forces, including T-34s and heavy IS-2 tanks. The Finns were outgunned and outnumbered, but they knew their equipment's limitations and employed it intelligently. By choosing engagement ranges carefully, using ambush tactics, and withdrawing before Soviet forces could concentrate, Finnish T-26 units survived and continued fighting until the armistice in September 1944. Some Finnish T-26s remained in service until 1960, making them among the longest-serving T-26 anywhere in the world. The Chinese experience with T-26 tanks adds another dimension to the story. The Soviet Union supplied approximately 82 T-26 tanks to China between 1937 and 1939, supporting Chinese resistance against Japanese invasion. These tanks fought in various engagements around Zhuzhou, Wuhan, and other battlefields. Chinese crews, hastily trained and often unfamiliar with armoured warfare concepts, struggled to employ the tanks effectively. Japanese forces, though lacking strong anti-tank capabilities early in the war, learned to counter Chinese T-26 using infantry tactics, close assault teams, and improvised anti-tank weapons. By 1940, most Chinese T-26 had been destroyed or had broken down beyond repair. A handful survived into the Chinese Civil War between communist and nationalist forces after World War II ended. These ancient tanks, veterans of multiple conflicts, fought their final battles in China's interior before being scrapped or preserved. The Chinese experience demonstrated that the T-26, like any weapon, was only as effective as the tactical doctrine, training and support structure surrounding it. In Soviet hands, with proper support, the T-26 could be effective despite its limitations. In Chinese hands, without adequate training or support infrastructure, the same tank achieved little. The T-26's role in Soviet propaganda and morale is often overlooked but was significant. During the darkest days of 1941, when German forces seemed unstoppable and Soviet defeats mounted, the Red Army desperately needed symbols of resistance. Soviet propaganda highlighted every instance of successful T-26 action, every German tank destroyed, every enemy position captured. These stories, often embellished or entirely fabricated, served important psychological functions. They convinced Soviet soldiers and civilians that resistance was possible, that the German invaders could be beaten. The fact that the victories often involved obsolete T-26 rather than modern T-34s actually enhanced the propaganda value. If ancient tanks could kill Germans, then surely the Red Army could win. Soviet newspapers printed accounts of heroic T-26 crews holding off entire German columns. Radio broadcasts celebrated tankers who destroyed multiple enemy vehicles. Posters showed determined crews manning their T-26s against fascist invaders. Much of this was mythology, but mythology serves a purpose in wartime. It maintains morale, encourages sacrifice, and builds the collective determination necessary to sustain a nation through existential crisis. The T-26, even as it disappeared from frontline service, lived on in Soviet propaganda as a symbol of early resistance and sacrifice. The technical evolution of Soviet anti-tank doctrine owed much to painful lessons learned with T-26. Soviet commanders in 1941 initially employed armour using outdated concepts, massing tanks for breakthrough attacks with minimal infantry or artillery support. This approach, which might have worked in the 1920s or against poorly equipped opponents, failed catastrophically against the Wehrmacht. German anti-tank guns, well-positioned and expertly handled, slaughtered Soviet armour. German combined arms tactics, integrating tanks with infantry, artillery and air support, overwhelmed Soviet forces that operated their tanks in isolation. The horrific casualties suffered by T-26 units in these doomed attacks forced Soviet commanders to rethink everything. By 1942, Soviet armoured doctrine had evolved significantly. Tanks now operated in close coordination with infantry and artillery. Anti-tank gun screens protected advancing armour. Air support, when available, suppressed enemy positions before tank attacks. The Soviets learned to concentrate armour for decisive attacks rather than dispersing it across wide fronts. They developed tank rider tactics, with infantry mounted on tank hulls to provide immediate protection against German close assault teams. These improvements, purchased with thousands of destroyed T-26 and tens of thousands of dead tankers, transformed the Red Army into an effective mechanized force. By 1943 and 1944, Soviet armour operations rivaled or exceeded German capabilities. The T-26 crews who died learning these lessons didn't live to see the victories their sacrifices enabled, but their deaths were not meaningless. The industrial story behind the T-26 deserves emphasis because it illuminates broader truths about Soviet wartime production. In 1941, when German forces overran huge swathes of Soviet territory, they captured or forced the evacuation of much of Soviet industry. Factories producing T-26 and other weapons were hastily disassembled, loaded onto trains, and shipped east to the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia. Workers, often women and teenagers because adult men were at the front, reassembled these factories under conditions of desperate hardship. They worked in unheated buildings in Siberian winter. They lived in barracks or dugouts. They subsisted on minimal rations, and they produced weapons. The same industrial base that had produced T-26s by the thousands in the 1930s now pivoted to producing T-34s, increasing output even as facilities were being evacuated. This feat, achieving greater production while simultaneously relocating much of Soviet industry thousands of miles east, ranks among the most impressive industrial achievements in history. It was possible partly because Soviet industry had learned mass production techniques from manufacturing T-26. The experience of building 11,000 relatively simple tanks had trained a generation of workers and engineers in the fundamentals of armoured vehicle production. When the time came to build more sophisticated tanks in vastly greater numbers, that trained workforce knew what to do. German intelligence assessments of the T-26 changed remarkably over time. Early reports from June and July 1941 dismissed it as obsolete and barely worth mentioning. By August, reports noted the troublesome quantity of Soviet light tanks and recommended increased anti-tank gun allocations. By late 1941, German intelligence had largely stopped tracking T-26s specifically, lumping them together with other light tanks as minor threats compared to the T-34 and KV-1. This fade-out from German attention actually confirms the T-26's successful role. By the time Germany stopped worrying about T-26, they had already served their purpose. They had absorbed German ammunition, consumed German time, died in their thousands, and bought the Soviet Union the breathing space it needed to survive. The German focus shifting to T-34s and KV-1s meant Soviet industry was successfully transitioning to modern designs. The T-26 could fade away precisely because it had enabled its own replacement. In the final accounting, approximately 6,600 T-26 tanks were lost in 1941 alone, destroyed in combat, abandoned due to mechanical failure, or captured by Axis forces. This represented about 65% of all T-26 in service when the war began. Another 2,000 or so were lost in 1942, and the remainder disappeared from service over 1943 and early 1944 through attrition, conversion to other roles, or transfer to training units. By 1945, perhaps fewer than 100 T-26 remained in active combat service with Soviet forces, all of them in the Far East preparing for operations against Japan. These survivors, veterans of a decade or more of service, represented the end of an era in Soviet armoured warfare. When they rolled into Manchuria in August 1945, they were participating in the last campaign where pre-war Soviet armour would see combat. After Japan's surrender, They were quickly retired, their crews transferred to modern equipment, the tanks themselves mostly scrapped. The human cost of T-26 operations defies precise calculation. Soviet records for the early war period are incomplete, destroyed in the chaos of retreat or never properly compiled. Estimates suggest that approximately 20,000 to 25,000 Soviet tankers died crewing T-26s during World War II, the vast majority in 1941 and 1942. Each T-26 had a crew of 3, meaning each destroyed tank potentially represented 3 dead or wounded men. With roughly 9,000 T-26s lost to all causes during the war, the mathematics of destruction become clear. These were mostly young men, conscripts or volunteers, who received minimal training and faced experienced, well-equipped enemies. Their survival rate was abysmal. Their contribution to Soviet victory was immeasurable. Every German soldier they killed was one fewer German attacking Moscow. Every minute they delayed the German advance was one more minute for Soviet defences to coalesce. Their deaths bought time, and time was what the Soviet Union needed most desperately in 1941. The T-26 light tank entered service in 1931 as a modern weapon, fought obsolescence through the 1930s, and died in vast numbers during the Second World War. It was never a great tank, never a weapon that inspired fear or respect, never a design that changed armoured warfare. It was simply present, in enormous numbers, when the Soviet Union needed tanks desperately. It fought not because it was effective, but because nothing else was available. It died not in glorious victory, but in grinding attrition, trading Soviet steel and blood for German time and resources. In the terrible arithmetic of industrial total war, this was sufficient. The T-26 didn't win battles, but it enabled the battles where Soviet victory eventually emerged. It didn't save the Soviet Union, but it helped prevent the Soviet Union's immediate destruction. That unheroic achievement, bought with thousands of destroyed tanks and tens of thousands of dead crews, deserves remembrance, not as glory, but as sacrifice, not as triumph, but as the grim determination to resist even when resistance seemed futile. The T-26's legacy is written in the survival of the Soviet state and the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. Not through T-26 heroics, but through the time its destruction purchased for better weapons to arrive and for the Red Army to learn how to win. In that sense, every T-26 that burned, every crew that died, every desperate ambush and doomed counterattack contributed to final victory. The tank itself was obsolete, inadequate, and doomed. But it held the line when the line needed holding, and sometimes that's all history requires.